week we began our four-part series on John Wesley by asking the question, why Wesley? And considering the role of any kind of person or tradition that serves as a mentor or a guide to us. Why that's important, and some of the things that it's just good to be aware of as we think about the mentors, the guides in our lives. And so, because for many of us, especially as a part of a local Church of the Nazarene, for many of us, John Wesley is a kind of a mentor, a kind of a theological, pastoral guide for our community. It's good to learn and know at least some basic things about him. Because for a guide, for a mentor, to truly be helpful in our lives, that guide, that mentor must be trustworthy, right? As you think about your own life, you can probably identify people in your past as well as currently who are trustworthy guides and mentors for you. You may also be able to think of some people who were in that role of being a guide and a mentor to you, but did not prove to be very trustworthy. And the damage from that, the harm from that, can be pretty significant. Right? So we need to know who our mentors are. And not only just individually, but again, as a community, right? The people who pass on the tradition to us, who were they? What were they about? And is that something that we can truly affirm and value? So today, after looking at the why Wesley question from last week, today we're going to consider the context. John Wesley's context. It's important to do that, I think, because context does matter. And when you're working with a mentor, when you're working with a guide, again, whether as an individual, one-to-one, or as a community of faith, working with a theological, historical mentor, someone like John Wesley and that Wesleyan tradition, it's important to know both their context and our context. Right? Yeah, need to know both. But certainly we want to know something about the context of our mentors. So just to ground that in real life, I was just even thinking this morning, pastoral leaders are often mentors and guides to us, aren't they? So we have a relatively new pastor here, Sean Siegfried, who, because of his roles in many ways, is a guide and a mentor to us. Now, if you think over just these past few months as we've been getting to know him and as he's been allowing us to get to know him, we've learned some things about his context, haven't we? Yeah. What are just some of the things? Name a few things about Sean's context that help us to know him.
He got saved on Sunday night in college church.
Yeah. So we know a lot about his own personal spiritual pilgrimage, don't we? And the role of a very formational community for him, right? Just down here in Olathe. College church. Loves the Chiefs. Yeah. Football guy, right?
He's been able to take that and bless the boys at Mid-America with his devotionals and encouragement of those guys and his prayer with them. That's amazing too.
Yeah.
He loves his family.
Role of family.
Very important.
Yeah. Well, these are just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
2.8 million people that are logged.
Every morning.
Mhm.
Ah.
Every-
Right,
every week.
that's great.
Identification with the greater Kansas City area. Yeah. So these are just some examples, right, of, and can you see how important context is? I mean, just as we think about our own pastoral leader here. Well, this is true for all of our mentors and guides, including those who are no longer living, but who still influence us. Right? So, John Wesley's context is important. And part of what reflecting on other people's contexts helps us to do is to become more aware of our own context. Right? And let me just suggest a few questions that we can kind of keep in mind as we move through our session here this morning, but in an ongoing way too, as you continue to reflect on the role of mentors and guides in your own life. Questions like these. How are the contexts, your mentor's context and your context, how are they similar? And conversely, how are they different? Let's just stay with that second question just for a second. As you reflect back on your own experience working with mentors and guides, why is it important to be able to identify ways in which the context of your mentor and your own context are different, that is not the same?
They see things in a different light to challenge you and help you think and push you forward in a
Okay.
positive way.
Okay, yeah.
Else you wouldn't need them.
Yeah, right. Right. So part of what this reminds us of is that mentors and guides help us in part because they're not the same as us. They're not identical to us. What else?
They help us see a different side of things.
Okay.
Whether it's a situation or
Okay.
perspective, it helps us open our eyes, even if we may not agree with
Yeah.
the context or
Mhm.
whatever. It just, I think it's good for us to see and hear another side.
Mark.
We have to contextualize for the contemporary context what we learn from them.
Okay. Can you say just a little bit more about that? What that means? Or what it might look like?
While being true to the truth that we have learned from them,
Yep.
we need to be able to interpret that to apply in our lives and the contemporary situation in which we find ourselves.
Okay. Yeah. Which means, for example, as we're working with people who mentor and guide us, we receive from them, but we're not just like a empty passive channel where what comes just kind of flows through us and automatically takes shape where we are. We have to receive it, but then we have to work with it through the filter of who we are, and sometimes interpreting it and then making application to our own context, so that what comes out in our lives or in our community, for example, won't just be an exact replica of what we received. Because our context is not identical to the context of our mentor or our guide, right? Nancy.
I was going to say that it's important, I think, to agree with them about something and to kind of make that choice too, because if you don't agree with them about anything, then you're probably listening to the wrong person.
There you go. Yeah, so sorting through what is the common ground, where do we agree, where do we disagree, and then you have to evaluate that. Is there sufficient agreement? Is there sufficient resonance such that this person really can function as a mentor guide in my life in a helpful, productive way.
What's interesting, though, is Jean Piaget said that learning really occurs in two forms. One is assimilation, where you just
Yes.
add it to what you already know.
Yes.
But genuine change and dramatic transformation happens through what's called disequilibration, and then we're arriving at a new equilibrium. And so sometimes there weren't a lot of things that the Pharisees agreed with Jesus on. And they did not accept him, many of them did not accept him as a mentor. Paul was transformed because he was willing to literally disassemble everything that he thought he knew and rebuild it with the truth that he discovered in Christ.
Good. Yeah. So that, good guides, good mentors in our lives, both individually and as communities, are those who help us to maintain important continuities in our lives, building on what we already have, while also challenging and pushing us towards transformation and change in those areas where we need it. Boy, that's a challenging balance, isn't it?
Sometimes they can knock you down a little bit for your shock and awe factor, so that you can see where you need to work on.
There you go.
You get a little upset at something, think about it, and think about why and why you think that way. So they can challenge you in positive ways, even though initially it's to you a negative.
Yep. So the third question.
Dr. Murray, I was
Please.
just going to say that we also need to be aware of their assumptions and their limitations.
Yeah.
We can kind of move towards a kind of quixotic, over-idealized notion of our mentors.
They're human beings, after all, aren't they? That's good. I like that word limitation. That's an important one. Sometimes we think of that as a negative word, but actually awareness of each other's limitations is an important foundation and basis for truly extending grace and compassion to one another, even as God does towards us with our limitations. Dave.
Does a mentor have to be a formal person? What about what we learn from each other?
Yeah, there you go.
All the same points apply.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying,
Good.
we can learn from each other without being in a formal relationship.
Yeah. So whether we're talking about formal, designated, role-based mentors, or whether we're talking about the more peer level, informal kind of mentoring we do, this third question is a good one. How does this other person's context inform what they bring to me? So what they bring to me, what the person or the tradition brings to us didn't just drop out of the sky. It's not just an abstract thing. How did their context inform what they bring? And then the final question, which is kind of where we need to make sure we're doing our work on our end. How does my context, how does our context inform how we're receiving what is coming to us from another?
I can use Pastor Sean as an example with my own life, and I think some in here would be in a similar situation to me. Just his not coming to the Lord until he was 18. I was raised in a church, so my parents were in the church before I was born, so I was brought to church as soon as possible after my birth and exposed to all things religion, from infancy on. So for me and for him, that was a very
Different context,
path,
wasn't it?
you know?
Yeah.
And so I listen probably a little differently because I don't relate to not always having the Lord in the home, you know. And so my heart goes out to him. You know, I guess I have some empathy, you know, because he didn't have that rich heritage that I was given, you know, which does make me relate in a totally different way than someone who identifies completely with not knowing the Lord until later in life.
Thank you for that, Shirley.
The question is, how does their context inform what they bring to you? It's like an authoritative new knowledge that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yes, it's another way to think, kind of an image or a metaphor would be, what grounds them? What's the ground in which they literally, right, were raised, brought up, shaped, and formed, and then that becomes a grounding for their beliefs, how they see the world, how they understand God, how they understand the nature of the world we live in, and then of course as we move into theology and practice, what really matters or what doesn't matter. How do we understand God's work of salvation? And then how are we then as individuals and communities to engage? What kinds of practices? Right? So that's where we're going to be moving in the next 2 Sundays, theology and practice. But today is to help us to appreciate a little bit of some of the ground, if you will, from which Wesley's theology and practice rose. So, first, most basic thing to consider about Wesley's context is that he lived his entire life in 18th century England. So he was born in, I think it was 1703, so right at the beginning of that century, and he died, was it in the 1790s something, I think? He lived a good long life. It was almost the whole length of the 18th century in England. That's quite a different context than ours, is it not? Now, as you think back over just your recollection of history, world history, what were some of the things that were going on in the 18th century?
Kings, queens, very powerful. That royal line is very.
Yeah. So a lot of government countries were functioning within monarchical systems, and that certainly was true for England, right? John, among other things, was a strong loyalist. He really believed strongly in the monarchy, the British monarchy.
So was he against the American independence?
Yes, he was not a fan of American independence.
Well,
so there you go. But now, having said that, right? Once the American colonies, okay, that's where our previous. Once the American colonies achieved independence and established this new country that we know as the United States of America, and as Wesley was overseeing the transition of Methodism in this country to have to adapt to a new context, there's that word again, right? An independent nation. Wesley worked with that new reality, not governed so much just by his personal political convictions, but by his understanding of the nature and purpose of the church and the mission of God. And so, for example, he made a very bold move to, on his own, without the official approval of the bishops of the Church of England, to ordain bishops in the American Methodist Church, in a sense acknowledging this is an independent country now. Now that didn't jive with his own personal political beliefs, but those political beliefs were not the governing thing in his life. Right? Jess.
He was in the early manifestations of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, Industrial Revolution. You remember studying that in school?
Massive impact on the culture.
And how did the Industrial Revolution affect, let's get down, I mean, it affected the economy, it affected what was going on globally, but if you think of like a typical English lower class family in the 18th century, what kinds of impact did the Industrial Revolution have on ordinary people?
Jobs were available in urban areas more than in the rural agricultural areas.
Which led to people moving. Yeah.
Child labor.
Child labor, which ended up not being a very good thing. Right. So
Massive pollution.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
lots of health concerns.
Major health concerns.
People who became dependent on other modes of self-reliance.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you were. This really introduced something that for almost all of us now is just the norm. But this was a new thing. The idea of you're an employee. Now, being an employee can be a very good thing if you've got a good employer, and if the conditions in which you're working are healthy and good, and if you're making a livable wage and everything, right? Being an employee, if those kinds of things aren't in place, can be a pretty awful experience. And of course, what aggravates that oftentimes is the sense that if you are an employee in an industrial, modern kinds of context, and you don't have control over anything hardly, and the conditions are bad, that has deep psychological impact, right? And so one of the things that began to characterize the lives of many in the 18th century, think about, again, how this influenced John Wesley's theology. Feelings of alienation, loneliness, uprootedness.
A sense of dependency, moving from being on the farm and you produced everything and you lived self-sufficiently for the most part. Now you're into a whole new system that everything is dependent on that system functioning.
It's like you owe your soul to the company.
There you go. Yeah, and of course we can see how this developed into all kinds of new manifestations when we move into the 19th century, and of course the 20th century, and some of what we are even aware of. But now here's the thing to remember. Wesley was on the front edge of this. It was just getting underway, and as many new radical changes and movements when they occur in society, even if they end up sort of being overall good, helpful things, often in the beginning decades, they're just really messy, chaotic, and messy, and harmful and hurtful to people's lives because people are living in a new reality they haven't figured out how to deal with it yet.
Well, and so many people moved from the agricultural area, there weren't enough jobs, and then we just had staggering poverty. The living conditions for many were just horrendous.
So you're seeing the first development of what we commonly would recognize as slums, the term slums, right? Yeah, Nancy.
I I read a lot of historical fiction, you know.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And one of the things, though, that goes the other direction is that I can't think of any time when individuals were allowed to own property until they came to America. So this sense of independence that you're talking about was fairly short. I mean, compared to the industrialization where they had somebody making decisions for them. I mean, at least they had some rights. I mean, they probably didn't
Yeah.
start with enough. But this is a brand new
Yep.
concept, is that you have
Yep,
a right.
that's right. And of course, those kinds of things develop, especially in the American context.
Right, well, hardly was true anywhere.
Right,
else.
that's right. That's right. Jess?
Another major influence on Wesley's thinking was the beginning of the Enlightenment.
Ah, yes, yes. Which is, could you give just a brief kind of definition of when we talk about the Enlightenment, what are we referring to?
We've got an explosion of new discoveries, of new nations, I mean, not new countries,
Yeah.
islands, this kind of thing. Suddenly, the ability to begin to investigate species, various, you go to a new area, you find new animals, new bugs, new insects you've never known before. You begin to think about that kind of thing. You're beginning to think differently. The economic disruption that occurred during that century, you have to begin thinking differently.
Hmm.
So you're beginning to think in terms of potential human development,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but you're also facing the potential for human degradation and all that is going on
Yep.
there. So you've got this tension that he was caught right in the middle of this thing.
So another name that's often used is it's the age of reason.
And people, were they learning more to read then? I mean, beginning of everyone reading.
Well, so
In some places.
yeah, that was, these developments accentuated the need for that.
Education of the common man.
You know, in an increasingly urbanized, poor area, literacy becomes even more important. So, yeah. Kathy?
So thinking about it from labor laws,
Mm.
that context,
Mm-hmm.
and job injuries, and so if there's no laws to really protect the new employees that are
Yeah.
needed for the Industrial Revolution, then when things happen to you at work, for example, and you have no control over that, you begin to live with a sense of hopelessness and despondency. It's like, why is this happening with me? So in that sense, maybe also there was a greater need or sense of community, the need for that, the need to be able to
Good.
come together for encouragement and for just that whole familial kind of thing, community.
So people in these contexts were searching for new ways of establishing community.
Like unions.
Well, that's one of the things that eventually emerged.
Right.
That's right.
It occurs to me that the kind of people that chose, I'm going to specify that, chose to come to America, had a certain kind of makeup, courage. They weren't like the normal person that was depending on being told what to do, when to do, how to do.
Huh. Interesting. I don't know if that's been studied or researched or not, but I mean that's an interesting hypothesis.
It would take a lot of courage to get on that
Yeah.
ship.
I mean, they had to face death.
Yeah,
And never
yeah.
seen their families again.
Yeah.
They had to be pretty desperate to leave.
Maybe not desperate, just
Well,
tired
Well.
of putting up with it.
Well, let's stay in England for now. And notice the things that we've been naming already. Very much, these were some of the things that I've been thinking of. We're on the same wavelength here, and so part of what again we're wanting to consider here is how did these things shape and form and influence John Wesley as he was living through this? What are some of the ways that these then became the ground out of which he developed and began to articulate a particular theology and a particular set of practices? And certainly one thing that we can acknowledge was that it was a century of major change and upheaval and turmoil that had while not yet the kind of global reach that we would come to recognize as we move into the 19th and 20th centuries, for people living in England, it was the beginning of an expanding of a world view that extended beyond just their own context. So questions of what is the nature of humanity in light of all this became really important. A second feature about John Wesley's context that I'd like to highlight this morning is the ecclesial piece, the church piece. And for Wesley, this meant unquestioningly the Church of England. Church of England was an expression of what we might more broadly think of as the Protestant Reformation. But this was an expression, a branch of Reformation that was very distinct from and did not occur at the same time as what was happening on the continent of Europe. So you think, for example, about who's the number one person we think of for Protestant Reformation? Good old Martin Luther. Other key figures would include people like John Calvin, right? John Zwingli. Those folk on continental Europe pioneered new expressions of Christianity over and against the Roman-based church, Catholic Church, right? The Church of England was not a part of that. In terms, it didn't come out of that root. The formation of the Church of England actually was initially primarily political. Henry VIII had enough of the Pope and decided to fashion his own church and so declared himself head of this new church. Now, a couple things were happening. So one, the Church of England at its beginning still looked pretty much like the Roman Catholic Church in terms of its actual practice and in most of its beliefs. However, the influence of the Protestant Reformation on the continent was making its way into England, and increasingly more and more ordinary folk in England were developing Protestant sensibilities and wanted their church to be Protestant through a whole bunch of things that we don't have time to go into in this short kind of a class. The Church of England came to solidify itself as a Protestant church, but a Protestant church that intentionally kept continuity with Catholic tradition, and for the large part maintained most of the features of church polity and worship and liturgy and practices that would have been familiar for Roman Catholics. By the time you get to the 18th century, now that process with Henry VIII began in the 1500s. Okay, so all of this had been working itself out for a couple of centuries by the time John Wesley came around. But in the 18th century, Wesley's century then, within the Church of England, you had a range of expressions from high church Anglicanism, which would be another way to describe that would be kind of Anglo-Catholic, all right? And in fact, both of John's parents, Samuel and Susanna, were very committed to high church Anglicanism. But on the other hand, you had within the Church of England another expression that was highly influenced by Puritanism. Some of you may recognize that term. The Puritan movement in Europe was a movement that was highly critical of a lot of the accumulated tradition within the Catholic and Anglican churches. It was strongly motivated by a desire to return to the purity of the primitive church. That was a term that was used a lot. Focused on simplicity, building church around only the things that you can find in the Bible, that kind of thing. And with linked often with high spiritual passion. So this influence of Puritanism led some Anglican clergy to line up with that, to reject the high church Anglicanism, and they became known as nonconformists. John Wesley's grandparents, both of his grandparents, were nonconformist clergy. So, can you see already how the context? So Wesley had grandparents who were on this side, the Puritan nonconformists. His parents deliberately chose high church Anglican because that wasn't what their parents were in. Right? And this was a very dynamic thing within the church. And what developed out of this over the work of a couple of centuries was a position within the Church of England that tended to be the standard normative mode, and that is that the Church of England is to be a place that is a via media. Now that's Latin, which basically means, anybody recognize? Anybody here? The middle way. The middle way. So rather than saying, we've got to figure out which of these two streams is the correct one, and then we're going to reject the other one, which of course is the tendency we have to do with so many things, isn't it? That kind of, are there things in each one that are important to the overall health of the church? And how can we create a church that provides a middle way? All of this was going on in the Church of England during John Wesley's lifetime. And so you can see how this significantly influenced. It became part of the context, the ground from which he then, especially once his Methodist movement was clearly moving into becoming its own church. Wesley had already been giving lots and lots of thought to what is the nature of the church, how narrow, how broad does the church need to be. So, in closing for today, I just want to share with you this little diagram. Sorry, it's copied out of a book, so the lettering might be a little bit smaller than. But it's an idea that from a contemporary theologian, Miroslav Volf, who in his book For the Life of the World suggests that we might think about the Christian life is an improvised life. That is to say, there are two foci in each of our lives, and I would suggest we can also say this is true of our communities. So if you think of the Church of the Nazarene more broadly, or even just Kansas City First Church of the Nazarene, the main focus, of course, is Christ, right? Jesus Christ, around whom our faith is built. But he says, you know what? There's another one, and that is our vocation and our location. In other words, our context. And so the Christian life always ends up being something that we develop and work through that reflects both our allegiance to Christ, but then also reflects the particularities of our vocation and our location. Which means, in a sense, Christianity is always improvising. If context matters, and that's part of what I'm suggesting this morning, if context matters, then living the Christian faith involves improvising. Now, so there's something just to take and think about a little bit as you're reflecting your own life. But as we head now, look towards the next two classes. Next week we're going to focus on Wesley's theology. Here's a thing to note. Because of, in part at least, the context that grounded John Wesley's life and ministry, he will bring to us a theology that has this quality of improvising. And the following week, he suggests and offers to us a set of practices to live out the Christian life that also involve improvising. Well, let's close in prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for your many gifts, including the gift of today. And we acknowledge that we live today in large part because of the todays that have come before us. And so as we've been exploring a little bit of the past, we ask that you would help us to wisely and compassionately receive that which comes to us from the past, and that you would guide and direct us as we seek to improvise with our present current realities in such ways that we would be truly faithful to the gift, the greatest gift you have given us in Jesus Christ our Lord, in whose name we pray. Amen.